Welcome to workshop number one, episode number three, where we're going to talk about thought control and thought work, where thoughts come from, how we can learn to control them, what thought work really means. And this is the beginning of several slides that will help us do that. So, understanding more about the origin of thoughts and thought processes will help us to restore honesty as a living, thriving element in our bodies and minds. We then can do the work of practicing thought control and watch the miracles happen. We use this tool to work all the 12 steps throughout life. The promise is that our thoughts will no longer condemn or unsettle or control us. No dread or shame or emotional trigger will overpower us because we have learned how to choose and employ faith in the work. When a threatening thought enters our conscious mind, we cannot control what pops into the stage of our mind, but we certainly can control how it affects us and how long it hangs around. This is the standard diagram that we use throughout the whole system of Respect the Path work. And we can see that we can follow the diagram by simply seeing each section or each bucket or as a box or a place where certain essential elements are stored. And we will break this diagram down in the next few slides. First, let's take a mental picture of the diagram so that this pattern or this basic system of universal thought process becomes very familiar to you. This system is referred to throughout everything we do in Respect the Path, and that we promote this because it is fundamental to the whole discipline of thought control. As you will see in further episodes, as we work to apply these things to specific sorrows such as addiction or codependency, anxiety, depression, and other things that bother us. There is a tremendous power in the application and the practice of thought control. If we are honest and desire to receive light and joy into our minds, and we're willing to do the work, we will see the joy of healing through these efforts. In the pre-thought bucket, we have everything that has happened to us since birth. Um, every experience, good or bad, traumatic or loving, whether we remember them or not, it's in this bucket. Equally important, in that same bucket, we have stored our interpretation of each experience. As we mature, our responses to memories and other current experiences change, which then causes more interpretations. So, a child who has a traumatic experience will make an interpretation of that experience. And as you can imagine, that child will not have the tools with which to understand the event. So the child will make, nonetheless, an interpretation of that experience. And so we know that that interpretation will be flawed. And then there is also, as we review certain things we remember from being a child, we pull them to the forefront of our minds and make another interpretation of them. We either are um, responsible for the behavior or we're not. And in that decision, we have to know that we don't have all the information because even through teenage years or young single adulthood, we don't have the tools to not only remember properly, but to interpret the previous interpretations. And so through life, this goes on. And when we get older, we still do the same thing. The memories pop forward. We believe the memories, even though they may be distorted. And then we make interpretations of them. And then we suffer the consequences of the negative interpretations. So it's really a big quagmire. But what we can learn from this is that without the proper tools, as we review and things pop forward in the form of thoughts and memories to our conscious mind, we can know that they are not based on complete truth because there wasn't an correct interpretation all along the way. And even as adults, when we think we really remember and that we really know what happens, if our paradigm is open enough, we have to admit that the interpretations and responses that we made every time we remembered something or was traumatized by something, we didn't have the correct tools to interpret it. So our trauma becomes a visceral response, which means it's cellular response, which sends us into a panic mode and terrible feelings and horrific fear. And this is the same situation that happens with PTSD. But even with that level of trauma, we have to understand that at the time of the previous trauma, there were probably things we did not understand, and or at the time that the PTSD or the trauma comes to our current minds, we have to know that it isn't the same and that we can have safety above all in our understanding of what is happening to us. So overall, we can build wonderful relationships with some of these things that bring us trauma and trigger us if we can understand that there were a lot of responses that were not full of the full truth. It's a crazy way to look at things, but it's the reality within this shifting massive bucket. At the first consideration, it can cause us frustrations, but we do not need to be frustrated with it. We can be uplifted. We can know that we are safe. So we are going to look at this and see that the interpretations of the experiences from birth till now, emotional responses to experiences, are all in the bucket. And so, without the proper tools, we developed responses not based on truth, and other people's intentions have to be considered, and the circumstances beyond our understanding. So, we're not deity. We don't understand fully what has happened to us as human beings. So we need the space to reevaluate and look at how we decide we're going to respond the next time that comes forward. And we will be able to make choices that are based on more truth. And so we have the responses create more interpretations, and that's a constant flux. But again, without the proper tools and without the understanding of what we want to do with those thoughts, we end up being somewhat crippled in all of this misinformation and misinterpretations. So the knowledge that we have been sent here to Earth to get challenged to the core then find our path back to peace through the gods, through discovering and trusting the light of the gods and the power of Christ, will give us courage to do this, because the truth is that pain is the great instructor, and God knows this. And we must come to learn and appreciate this phenomenon. Meanwhile, we will become comfortable with the truth that what is stored in this subconscious space has many unrealistic interpretations. Therefore, we can ease our grasp on some of the memories which haunt us. And we will delve into this detail in further episodes in the workshops. But one of the kickbacks that I get often in discussing these things in workshop is the traumatized, betrayed woman who has these in her bucket also. She's traumatized repeatedly because the behavior is a trigger, or the text is a trigger, or the email, or the voicemail, or something happens, or the sound or the smell of something that was part of the abuse to begin with is there. But what we can understand when we fully understand these thought details is that we don't have to accept that visceral response. My husband used this in his PTSD recovery from the war in Vietnam, and he refused to allow the repeated trauma triggers to abuse him repeatedly. He would still experience the visceral sweating and the initial understanding that there was fear involved and the trauma of the horror. But at the very same moment, he would be able to say to his conscious mind, I am safe, I survived that, and I do not have to participate with that visceral response. I am the boss of my body, and I can have quiet in my mind right now. And so part of his conditioning, along with the thought work that we're going to be talking about next episode, gave him the power over the worst kind of PTSD. And a woman who has been betrayed can learn the same thing. She can learn that she is the master of her mind and her responses. This is a tremendous gift from the gods. This gift is already in us. The power to do this is part of the light of the magnificence we have as women. And we just need to connect to it and make that connection become easy and swift and smooth for every time we are challenged. The triggers may keep coming, but we are not afraid of them. They do not challenge us in the way they used to, and we will overcome them over time. I know this. So while we are dealing with this pre-thought bucket and all of that that's going on, we are also building and maintaining a database. And we create a database of personal programming in the natural or the pain mind. Now, it doesn't have to remain a negative, but what usually happens is that the negative part of our minds usually is the bully in the brain situation. So the database is full of a lot of negative behavior from this database that we have built while we've been dealing with the early abuses or sorrows that we are trying to heal from. And so we continue to entertain incorrect interpretations which cause angst and worry and anxiety, albeit we must remember that the interpretations are often based on untruth. This self database is full of self judgment, good and bad, feelings of love and feelings of disgust. And so this is basically what we have built as a paradigm or the way that we see the world and our place in it. And this is the way we feel about our world and our place in it. And this is where repetitive thinking patterns develop because we believe that paradigm. Everything that happens to us, we measure through that paradigm. So, for instance, if we have a self paradigm of blame or self pity, then we filter everything that happens to us through those two thought patterns. And then it means that when something hard happens to us, it's somebody else's problem. Somebody else did that. Or poor me, look what happened to me again. And then we just continue to build the negative paradigm. And that becomes poisonous to our relationships. And we cannot have that. So part of the thought work actually comes around to an understanding that we actually make the choices full of light that will then encourage and facilitate light moving into that paradigm. And it literally, consciously, physically changes that database slash paradigm into something that is healthy. And so when we look at what happens to us, even though it can be drastic, if we have a paradigm full of gratitude or joy or appreciation of relationships around us, we don't struggle with those blame or self pity or anger paradigms because we have now changed the way we build that paradigm, and we build it constantly through our lives. And so we need to learn that we're not going to allow those controlling or hate filled or frustrated paradigms to rule us. So we learn that it's not that we are evil, that we build these paradigms that are negative. It's just that we don't know any different. We haven't been taught that we can have power over these things. We think we go through life with these badges of burden that we're carrying and that we can't escape it. And in our work we teach we don't bow to those negative things because the light and the magnificence in us will help us to change the way we think, which changes everything else. And so this is the way we view how things happen to us and what happens to us and what we're going to allow it to do to the cells in our bodies. It's a remarkable thing when we realize that we have that innate power in us. So I've talked a lot about the paradigm in podcasts before, but we need to move on here and just quickly talk about the two light and dark filters that we are going to use in our thought work. I've talked a lot about the straw effect, and so what that means in 32 seconds is the fact that if we do not open our paradigm and loosen up our grip on what we think we have suffered and how and why we have suffered it, that our paradigm will being closed, and we will not be willing to do the thought work that is required to change our paradigms into light filled paradigms. And that's basically what that means. Those filters. We're going to learn that it is a filter. The shadow filter is one on pride and selfishness, and these are aggressive patterns, and they become our reality. Occupation with this reality creates most of our spiritual and behavioral stagnation. Repetitive use of this filter keeps the database dark and painful. Addictive thought patterns are perpetuated here. So when we have a thought and we have a paradigm and we have to deal with that, and we're going to change where that thought ends up, we're going to refuse its pathway to the shadow filter. We're going to change its pathway. We're not allowing it to go down the shadow filter into the rabbit hole, and we're going to talk about rabbit holes next time. So this is vital to understand. This is my favorite slide ever because it teaches us that we have a faith filter or a light filter within us that we get to choose if we want to. It's already there, and we're ignoring it most of the time. If we're full of sorrow, it's really hard to reach that unless we are taught that we have the capacity to do that. So, through conscious thought practice, the natural mind chooses and practices positive pathways. Repentance and spiritual growth remind the pain mind to listen to the light. God centered thoughts become the driving force. The database is reprogrammed as Christ's light is allowed to flow freely. So, these two filters, we use them constantly. We will make ways for our thoughts to be channeled down through this faith filter, and then we will see how that facilitates a light impression on the current paradigm. It is a beautiful thing to see. It's magnificent, and we can learn to do this and help us in our recovery in every way and throughout our entire lives, no matter what challenge comes to us. I know these things. So that we're out of time. So next time we will continue on this journey to understand what's going on in the thought control world. So I'll see you next time. This is Michelle Noel. Come back.